Hi, I'm Christopher Trisos at the Africa Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town.
And I'm Felix Kalaba from the KwaZulu-Natal University in Zambia.
And we'll be talking today about climate change risks to biodiversity in Africa, risks and response options. So, brief outline of the talk. First, we'll talk a bit about transdisciplinary research in climate risks, then climate change risk to biodiversity in Africa, and then some adaptation options to reduce risk. So first, we'd like to emphasize that taking a transdisciplinary approach is essential for understanding climate risk and essential for climate risk research, especially in the conservation space. And so this means both doing science in teams, but in an interdisciplinary team, so not just climate scientists or ecologists, but also people from social sciences and humanities, familiar to many conservation biologists. And finally, the third part of this puzzle is really involving policymakers from the beginning, so that your science is actionable, it's answering climate risk questions of relevance to policy. A second important part of this is taking an anti-oppressive or decolonial lens from more ethical ecology to our work, and so that's both a wider view on who counts as experts, open access, open data, knowing the histories of the place you work, people who've had long histories of occupation on those lands, and also doing ecology in more inclusive teams. So this isn't a complete list for this type of work, but we think there's some useful starting steps to think about when engaging in climate risk research for ecosystems and biodiversity. Now onto the real subject of the talk here, climate change risk. The IPCC has an updated definition of climate change risk, and that is the potential for adverse consequences for human or ecological systems. In the context of climate change, these risks can arise from potential impacts of climate change, as well as the human responses to climate change. So this is saying that the risks to biodiversity and ecosystems come not just from the climate hazards like heat waves or droughts, but also how human systems respond to those climate hazards can have indirect impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity. And to illustrate that, there are a number of climate change risk pathways, such as through infrastructure, through socioeconomic systems, like impacting GDP and people's jobs and livelihoods, also agriculture and food security, impacts in human health, which may change how people use resources and landscapes, and then last but definitely not least, environmental change and changes in ecosystems. So where are we with understanding climate change risks to biodiversity and ecosystems in Africa now? Well, first, there's already evidence of widespread impacts of increased atmospheric CO2 and climate change on biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services in Africa. Second, existing patterns of economic development and land use change are compounding these climate change risks. And third, risks to biodiversity and ecosystem functioning are expected to increase with every fraction of increase in global warming. So this is a short video showing how risks to species richness across the world could be expected to increase throughout this century with increased global warming. And what you're watching now is a simulation of the percentage of species at any particular grid cell exposed to potentially dangerous temperature conditions as climate change continues under a high emission scenario. So this is getting to about 4 degrees or more than 4 degrees global warming by the end of the century. So you can see really extensive across the tropical oceans and in parts of West Africa, tropical Africa, and Southern Africa. So the next simulation, this is now a low emission scenario, keeping global warming, limiting global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. You can see up to 2030, a pretty similar pattern, but by mid-century, the number of places at risk is substantially less. Still expanding in the tropical oceans, high risk for things like coral reefs and seagrasses. But towards the end of the century, the risk is stabilized under this low emissions pathway. And recent research suggests that this increase in risk over the century, if you're in any particular place, this is an example from the Cayman Islands and the Caribbean, but similar examples exist along the African coastline and on land. What this gray line is showing is the historical temperature at the location, the red line, the future projection under a high emission scenario, and this black line is showing the percentage of species at the site that are forecast to exceed their thermal niche limit in the future. And what's important to note about this line is it's not increasing gradually. You see this abrupt jump around the 2070s in this case. And what this research suggests is in many locations, multiple species at a site will have their thermal threshold exceeded around about the same time, sort of within a decade of each other. So this suggests that there could be these abrupt disruptions of ecosystems in the future. That climate change globally might proceed gradually, but at any individual site, you could have a really abrupt disruption of biodiversity, which for conservation managers, in particular national parks or local areas, is something to sort of keep in mind, that the changes could be rather sudden as opposed to gradual. And this is a map showing that degree of abruptness globally. So the deeper red and purple colors here are showing the percentage of species forecast to be exposed suddenly to climate change. And so across large parts of sub-Sahara, Africa, Central Africa, into Southern Africa, and the tropical oceans around the coast of Africa, we're looking at about half of the species at a site could be suddenly exposed to climate conditions beyond their historical niche limits. That said, there are substantial benefits to African biodiversity of limiting global warming to low levels. So on the left panel here, this is for insects, vertebrates, and plants. The colors going into the blues is the percentage of species at a site that avoid geographic range loss by limiting global warming to a low level. And you can see from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, limiting global warming to that lower level has some substantial benefits, sort of 20% of species in a lot of places. But going from 3.2 Celsius down to 2 Celsius, limiting to the Paris Agreement of 2 or below, has really substantial benefits. And one of the standout areas globally is the Southern African region. You can see it here, particularly for vertebrates. Large percentages of species stand to benefit from limiting global warming. It's not just the species lost from climate change, there's also future land use change projected with particular climate scenarios. And so in the orange here on these maps are locations that are at risk from climate change, where a high percentage of the species, more than 10%, are at risk of local extinction from climate change. The blue is places where species are at risk from land use change. You can see very extensive across the landscape. And in black are areas where both climate change risk and associated land use change risk is high. So again, at higher levels of global warming, that area at risk from climate change expands. This area in Southern Africa at risk from both land use change and climate change. It's not just terrestrial species at risk, but also freshwater species. There's been some research recently summarizing this for major river basins in Africa. These are some of the most species-rich river basins on the continent. And what's being shown here is that increasing levels of global warming, the increasing proportion of species in these river basins at risk from climate change. So that's reduced flow, increased water temperatures, particularly in the Senegal Basin, also the Zambezi, even the global warming levels around 2 degrees, you're looking at about 10% of species at risk. And in the Senegal Basin, even higher, it's sort of half of species at risk at 2 degrees Celsius global warming. Again, illustrating enormous benefits of limiting global warming to low levels. For vegetation change, the picture in Africa remains quite uncertain. There's some strong evidence indicating that increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide to date has increased bush and shrub encroachment. So that's this figure on the top here is showing how with increasing CO2, it's expected that forests and savannas, forests would expand into savanna, savanna expand into grassland. However, under future forecasts, there are parts of the continent where aridity is expected to increase, and that could counteract the CO2 effect. So you might expect forest and savanna expansion into grasslands, but in areas that are more arid, It could be you have grassland expansion into areas of savanna and forest. In areas with decreasing aridity, it could reinforce that increasing CO2 effect, so you could get even more bush encroachment and forest encroachment. Precipitation forecasts and aridity forecasts for a lot of Africa are highly uncertain. There's more certainty in drought forecasts in the southwest of Africa and along the North African coast, but in Central, East, and West Africa, these projections remain very uncertain, and vegetation responses are uncertain, partly as a result of that. Climate change risk, here's an example looking at some ecosystem services. We're talking about wild food plants in Southern Africa. This is an under-researched area. And what we're seeing on the left there is the species richness of plants that have some human use listing. This could be as traditional medicines, as teas, as spices, as snacks eaten while walking in the veld. And on the right there is their exposure to climate change under a 3.4 degrees Celsius global warming. These levels of global warming around 3 Celsius are consistent with current government pledges. That might change as a result of the climate negotiations happening in Glasgow. In fact, it likely will, that increased ambition and pledges will bring that global warming level down. However, action to date still sees us, like there's a big difference between what governments are pledging and what they're actually doing. So a 3 degrees Celsius warming world, unfortunately, is still not that unlikely. And in that case, in these parts of Southern Africa, you would expect potentially increasing climate suitability for wild harvested food plants along the South African mountain areas as species move upland to track climates into cooler areas, and a decreasing species richness around parts of northern South Africa and Botswana. So shifting gears slightly to a different part of risk, and that's up to now, we've looked very much at the risks from climate hazards, things like increasing temperatures, lower river flow, drought, and now considering the risks from responses to climate change, human responses. So climate change risks to biodiversity can be indirect. They can come from climate change risks in other sectors like agriculture. They can also be risks from mitigation responses to reduce greenhouse gases like afforestation. There can be transition risks, such as financial impacts on governments and on countries currently very dependent on fossil fuels that might impact conservation funding. There could be risks from reduced tourism around increased, for example, carbon taxes to flying, or reputational risks or increased inequality between communities if they're excluded from the benefits of renewable energy economies. And there can also be trade-offs of adaptation responses or mitigation responses to climate change with other societal objectives such as economic development. So here's one example of a potential response risk. This is some very basic climate suitability modeling, but looking at major crop types, where the blues and the reds are showing areas that are projected to increase in crop suitability under future climate change, and this might shift agricultural zones. So some shifting of agricultural zones potentially north along that Sahara border, and also parts of Central Africa and the Horn of Africa, not as pronounced as in parts of the Northern Hemisphere, where agriculture is really projected to shift north in the near Arctic zones, but certainly parts of Africa potentially, and at a more local scale for things like coffee crops or cocoa crops, where forecasts are more uncertain. There could be a lot of changing agricultural suitability and land use change as a result of that in areas that are currently relatively unaffected by agriculture. So that's one indirect route of climate change affecting biodiversity. Another is risks from tree planting for greenhouse gas mitigation. So I think many of us can agree that protecting and restoring indigenous forests is a good climate change mitigation and possibly adaptation strategy. Nevertheless, Africa is being targeted for very widespread tree planting campaigns as part of nature-based solutions to climate change. And many of the global maps produced for these tree planting campaigns identify ancient grassy biomes of savannas as reforestation opportunities, and they might do this erroneously, which puts these grassy biomes at risk of afforestation and potentially also risk to the biodiversity and ecosystem services such as water provisioning that comes out of those biomes. So now moving beyond responses, kind of one level more complex again in risk assessment, we see that we can't just look at climate change risks as individual risks, risks to freshwater fish or risks to terrestrial biodiversity, but really that these risks interact, so they can compound. When one risk interacts with another, they can also cascade, where one risk triggers another that triggers multiple downstream risks. And so an example of a compounding risk is, this is the wild harvested food plant example again, but now it's not just the risk to wild harvested food plants we're looking at, but also risks to crops, in this case sorghum and maize, showing that areas in the pink color there are places where both wild food species are projected to decrease in occurrence under high levels of global warming, as well as crop yields are projected to decrease. So communities that to date might have used those wild harvested food plants as a sort of nutritional safety net in times when crop yields fail, might no longer have that nutritional safety net available to them. Here are some examples of cascading risk. I'll just go through the one on the right-hand side of fishing communities in the tropics, showing you can have a climate change risk to coral reefs from coral bleaching. That can cascade to risks to property and infrastructure with reef degradation, making the reef less of a storm protection under climate change with storm surges. Can also lead to a risk to human life and a risk to the fishing industry as fisheries move further offshore, which can again risk livelihoods and human life, but also present risks to pelagic fish populations that leads to this cascading risk dynamic, where a risk to coral reefs is then cascading out to affect multiple aspects of human and environmental systems. Okay, so that's the risk summary. This is a rainforest in Gabon, one of those vegetation examples where we're quite uncertain of how future climate change may affect parts of this ecosystem, at least for the vegetation. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Felix Kalaba to talk about how we might be able to respond.
Thank you very much, Chris. So how can we respond, or how should we respond? The photo before us was taken in the western part of Zambia, and this is actually a homestead that was flooded. So how then should we respond to the various risks? One of the ways which we ought to respond to this risk is via ecosystem-based adaptation. EBA uses biodiversity and ecosystem services to assist people to adapt to climate change. When you look at Africa's national determined contribution documents, you realize that over a third of adaptation actions are actually EBA. And of these adaptation actions, 80% fall within the agriculture, forestry, and land use, as well as environment and water subsectors. As you look at those within agriculture, there is conservation farming. There are others that are focusing on management of catchment areas. But one of the challenges is actually the financial constraints to the implementation of these EBA projects. There is a will. This is well written in the national documents, but however, implementation is not there due to financial constraints. What are some of the barriers to adaptation and resilience building? There are quite a number of barriers. One is the poor livelihood and economic diversification. A number of countries are embarking on economic diversification, but this has not materialized. There are also high rates of land degradation, low level of technical and technological capacities. The infrastructure in many African countries is also inadequate. There are also entrenched cultural and politically driven practices, which are barriers to adaptation. Weak policy implementation is another one. Despite the increasing notice in the continent, implementation remains poor. There are also persistent inequalities. So when you look at all some of the barriers that we have to adaptation and resilience building. Now, let's talk about the cumulative risks and barriers. And as we look at this, we're going to look at the positive feedback loops. When you look at a number of sectors, infrastructure, socioeconomic, health, agriculture, and environmental risks, these risks of climate change are not independent of one another, nor are they various barriers to adaptation. So the risks and barriers tend to magnify each other. There are these positive feedback loops, which result in a complex systemic risk profiles across scales. So you realize that the risks will impact the barriers, and the barriers also impact the risks. So it's important for us to appreciate the fact that these risks and barriers magnify each other. Now, as we think of moving towards improved climate change adaptation, what is it that is required? In a number of countries such as Zambia, the complex and emergent properties of the socio-ecological system are combined with their strong dependency on climate systems, elucidate the intrinsic and this relationship between climate change and sustainable development. There's need to realize that effective adaptation responses need to take a systemic approach that attempts to address a number of complex climate change risks concurrently with existing barriers to adaptation. Now, this is particularly important in view of the last slide, where it's clearly shown the link between the risks and barriers. So addressing this requires a concurrent actions that ensure that these are looked at in a systematic way. This requires a strong understanding of local level dynamics to minimize the risks of maladaptation. Livelihood diversification is one of the options that you find in a number of countries' development plan. Now, the dominant discourse around adaptation in Africa is focused around agriculture-based livelihoods, which are facing the greatest risk from climate change. Now, this is important to note because if diversification is going to be within the agriculture-based livelihoods, there is the high risk of maladaptation in the sense that communities and countries may end up adapting in activities or actions that are very sensitive to climate change. There is a significant opportunity, but this significant opportunity of diversification of livelihoods comes with a challenge as we think of maladaptation, which may result from the various local system dynamics if they are not properly understood. For example, diversifying in agricultural practices requires knowledge, it requires skills, it requires inputs to grow multiple types of crops, and this is actually a challenge. This diversification will require multiple and different types of livestock. Not only could this cost more in the short run, there's also a great risk of making mistakes. So it's important for us to note that diversification can also lead to localized competition for markets, leading to possible conflicts.
Thank you, Felix, and thank you everyone for listening, and we look forward to answering your questions in the plenary discussion. Thank you very much.